Hey guys, it's Tom from 6 Foot Networks. It's been a few months since I've done an actual tutorial video, so I'm gonna start getting back into these here. You can probably hear some background noise. I'm doing this outside as my son is inside watching TV, and it's just a little bit too noisy in there. So I brought all my stuff outside to record this video, so excuse any background noise. However, this video we're going to talk about preparing VMware Fusion for the installation of CentOS 8 Linux. Now, as many of you guys know, we are pretty specifically a Mac-based shop. I think as far as we go, all of our support of Windows is done in VMware, and I don't actually believe that even our engineers have PCs. I think everything is done on Macs. So specifically, this in this video is going to talk about what I do personally to set up VMware to support a working CentOS 8 Linux server. Now, CentOS 8 is the newest release of CentOS, and it's also my go-to version of Linux that I choose for all of my installations, specifically in production. So basically, what we're going to do is first things first. We're going to run VMware. I already have VMware Fusion running, and for those who are curious, this is the professional version 11.1.1, and there's the build number. Yeah. Okay, so first things first, you can see that I already have several Linux virtual machines here, as well as other virtual machines that I work with. But basically what I did was I went online and I downloaded the CentOS 8 installer, the ISO file, specifically, and I will put the link to this file in the video description below. But anyway, here's what we're going to do. We're going to start off by going into File and New, and basically this is the wizard for VMware. Now what you can do is you can take your ISO image and put it here, right? And basically what that'll do is it'll parse it out, and it'll tell you, it'll kind of break it out. It's not very accurate, CentOS version 5 and earlier. I think CentOS 8 is just a little bit newer than what VMware can handle, so it's fine. It's not a problem. We'll just hit continue. I'm unchecking the Linux Easy Install because I want you to see what the traditional installation of a Linux system would look like if you were to either install it on a physical piece of hardware or in a virtual environment like this. This tutorial is pretty much boiled down to you can use either VMware Fusion or you could use VirtualBox. It really doesn't matter. However, my preferred method is I'd like to see what the OS is doing. All these easy installers just take all the fun out of it. And yeah, so we're going to continue. At the summary window here, it basically tells you that, what it parsed out was, CentOS version 5 and earlier, which it's not. New hard disk, capacity 20 gigs, which we're going to change. Memory 1 gig. And all of this is based off the fact that VMware thinks this is version 5. So we're going to customize these settings. Where are we going to save it? We can just save it on the root of the virtual machines, which is fine. So we're going to label this CentOS 8 server. 64-bit is fine. You can name it whatever you'd like. Okay. So what this did was it created the container. It actually went forward and created the settings for the virtual machine. You can see them down here. And it parsed out all of this information that it showed you a minute ago. So what we're going to do is because we set the box, or we check the box that says, customize settings. These are the settings for the virtual machine. And pretty much you want to do this before you actually get going. Because after you start setting up CentOS 8, if you start making changes in the configuration, you may end up with a system that's not bootable. So you want to really do this ahead of time. So what I go through is I literally go through all of these. CentOS 8. So here we're going to pick, let's see what we have here. So we're going to actually pick CentOS 7 because that's the closest to this. CentOS 7 was the previous release. Like I said, CentOS 8 just came out, I want to say 2 months ago. So I'm not sure if VMware had the chance to update their support for this. However, it does work, so it doesn't matter. So I'm just going to add a note in here that says, test server, demo. And then you can also put the date in if you really want. I usually do that just to know what build it is. And then that's pretty much it for this. You can also check this box here. It actually can't check it because we don't have snapshots enabled yet. So that's fine. Going back. Don't care about shared folders. Keyboard and mouse, I usually leave default. Processors and memory, here's where it gets fun. Now I got a Mac that's got a lot of cores in it. And this is the 2018 MacBook Pro that I'm using here for this demo, so it's fair to say that 4 cores, and there's a lot more RAM available than a gig. So we're going to actually put, I usually like to do 8192 because it's 8 gigs of RAM, and that's kind of my baseline for starting a virtual machine. Here's the reason. I think that with the fact that computers are so powerful these days, this MacBook was the top of the line at the time I bought it. The only part that I skimped on a little bit was the SSD drive because I felt the prices were a little bit outrageous from Apple. So this computer, as you can see here, only has a 2 terabyte disk in it. But everything else, it's got the top of the line i9. I think it's a 2.9 gigahertz CPU. Actually, here, I'll show it. So yeah, 2.9, 15-inch, 2018. There's the version of OS I'm running. I am doing this in Catalina. 32 gigs of RAM, graphics, serial number, whatever. And that's pretty much it, So I believe that it's okay for me to spare 4 cores and 8 gigs of RAM for this virtual machine. Display, not necessary. We're going to use CentOS 8 in the command line, so there's not really any graphics. Network adapter, I am going to actually use it on Wi-Fi. I don't have currently a wired network out here, but because this is going to be a server, you really want to go forth and actually specify your network interface, and you want to bridge it. So usually I can use my USB-C Ethernet adapter and hardwired in, but for now I'm just going to use my airport, which is fine, and this is the IP that it's going to bridge to, so it's fine. Hard drive. Here's the fun part. Expand the advanced options. Make this actually NVMe because this is on SSD. Or you can make it SATA, it's fine. The performance will be just as great. So in fact, we'll leave it on SATA. And then here, because this is going to be a server, I would say let's do 60 gigs of disk space and resize that. So here's the reasoning for this. Back in the day, when you installed Linux, you only needed like 4 gigs of disk space, maybe 8, to install it. The problem is as you start doing stuff with it, you start creating files on it, you start moving data around, you're going to end up filling up that disk pretty quickly. And with a 2 terabyte disk inside this Mac, there's no reason for me to create a virtual machine disk that's, a few gigs in size, 20 gigs or whatever. So if this was anything other than a server, I would probably start out at 160 gigs. So if I was virtualizing Windows, if I was virtualizing Mac OS, if I was virtualizing, any OS that has a graphical front end, um, I would use something over 100 gigs. Just because you want to, you want to leave yourself enough space to work in, plus any updates, software updates, OS updates, whatever. You got to put those somewhere. Down the line, you're going to end up constricting your disk, all for what? you know, for no reason, because you have a 2 terabyte disk inside the computer, and you could spare yourself a little bit of space for this. Or you end up having to delete it and start over, which is what I do. I build these things probably 2 or 3 times a week. I create a separate virtual machine for another system that I'm building. So anyway, take it for what it is. Let's start at 60 gigs for this particular demo virtual machine. CD, I already told it to use the CentOS 8 installer. Again, the link to this particular installer is down below. Basically, CentOS has a mirrored system where it picks servers that are closest to you, but you can pretty much download them from any of the servers that are available worldwide. And best of all, it's free. So you want to make sure that that image is listed here. And again, you can change this if you want to SATA, because newer computers are all SATA based. There's no such thing as IDE. Sound card, turn it off. Remove it. We don't have any sound coming out of a server. USB and Bluetooth, just leave it the way it is. Printer, don't care. Camera, don't really care. But it does have my FaceTime camera, and there you can see me sitting in the dark out here. Actually, here, I'll wave. Hey. I'll remove this camera as well, because it's not necessary. Startup disk. This looks familiar, doesn't it? For all you Mac users, this looks exactly like the Mac OS startup disk preference pane. Not worried about that. Compatibility. This by default should be set to using the latest version, and it actually tells you limits of what this version supports in terms of OS. So that's kind of interesting to look at. Now this is maximum, obviously. Like, I don't have 8 terabytes of disk space in this computer, or 10 network adapters or 64 gigs of RAM. But what's funny is I'm halfway there. So the maximum support for VMware is literally 200% of this Mac. That is a laptop that will soon be probably beaten in terms of memory, at least, and processors. Although I think this is 16 physical processors, so it's meant for server environments. Anyway, so we'll leave that be. Isolation. I always enable isolation in command line based programs or operating systems, because you can't drag and drop between a graphical OS and a command line interface using this system anyway. So there's no point. That's just one more thing that could go wrong. I do, however, pass power status to the VM, even though it's not really necessary. And I do change the firmware type to UEFI. I think the power status is mainly force of habit, because I do so many graphical OSs that I want the OS to know what's happening. So if there's a low power alert and I'm working in a Windows virtual machine, I want the Windows virtual machine to notify me that I'm at 20% battery or whatever, if I'm mobile, or whatnot. So that's just a force of habit. Synchronized time, yeah, I want to make time, as close as possible, so that way logs and stuff are sort of in sync. For virtualization, I don't do secure boot. However, if you are doing, virtual machines for production, like if you're setting up a production server that's gonna at some point run on your network, you probably want to consider secure boot. But it's not necessary, especially if your farm is, your server farm is behind lock and key and biometrics and whatever else could possibly be there. And that's pretty much it. So we just went through the settings of setting up a CentOS virtual machine inside the server, inside a virtualizer, or in this case VMware Fusion. So we can close this, and now if we hit this giant play button here, this will actually start reading off of this ISO image that I saved here on my desktop. So what do we want to do? We want to install Linux. And then that's pretty much it. The next video, I'll talk about how to go through, installing services and whatnot. But in this video, we're gonna go through the install and pretty much just get it to, maybe I'll even patch it. We'll go through the patching process. That just makes sense. So assuming that we're online here, we should get the graphical installer here. There it is. So pick your language. We're in the US, so we're going to keep English US. And there's the version of Linux, CentOS Linux 8.0.1905. So this is the pretty standard CentOS Linux installer. Here you can actually pick, like time zone. You can actually click on the state you're in. We're in Los Angeles, so yay, let's do that. Let's set the time correctly. It is currently 18, let's say 09 or 07. That's today's date. Network time, I don't think that'll work yet, because we don't have networking yet, so that's fine. Network and host name, there is our virtualized adapter. Let's turn it on, let it connect. Okay, so there's our IP address, our network, our route, and our DNS servers that it pulled from my DHCP system. Let's change the name to CentOS VM test, whatever, 01. Alright, dot. We'll do a full qualified domain name. So there's your current host name. Hit done. Now we can actually go back to date and time, turn that on, and it'll actually set the date and time for us. So, which it did, it synchronized up. Let me back up. Sorry, I went a little too far. So from this window, you can see here you set your localization. Here is basically what software you want to use from the software selection and the installation source. So we're going to use everything that's inside this image right here that I have on the desktop, which is the full image, by the way. They also have just a bootable image, which is CD worthy, and if you have a machine that needs a CD, you can burn it to a CD. It's like 560 megabytes in size. This is DVD. I think this would require, an 8 gig DVD or 9 gig, whatever they are. So what we're gonna do is we have the source software selection. We're not gonna do server with GUI. We are going to do minimal install. That's all we want. Minimal install. There's no reason for any of the other junk that gets put down into Linux. It's just one more thing that you have to contend with when it comes to security. So, and I don't add any add-ons either. The skinnier the OS, the more secure it is, if you ask me. I feel like when you start piling on, utilities, tools, graphical front ends, and whatnot, you end up piling on a lot of stuff that could potentially, you know, open your exposure a little bit more to folks that are trying to, you know, break into your system. So minimal install, basic functionality is all we need, and it also takes the least time to install. So we already did that. We're going to partition. We're going to just leave it automatic, so it already recognized the virtual disk here, 60 gigs free, and that's what we're going to do. We're going to just hit done, and automatic partitioning has been selected. We don't really care about kdump at the moment, and as far as security policy goes, I don't have one. Not for this install. So once you address all the issues here that need to be addressed, we hit begin install, and you'll see that this takes almost no time to do. It's already a third of the way done. In the meantime, what you want to do is you want to set your root password, so I'm going to do that right now. Let me get something that's a little bit better here. Sure, why not? I know I'll forget it in a minute. So we're gonna do, oops. So that was the root account. This is going to be just the end user account. We're gonna make him an administrator. We're gonna set a simple password for this. Just something that we can get in with. It doesn't matter if the little scale here is red. It's a good password. It's alright. So we're going to just say done. So we have root password set, and we have a user account being created on install. So see, it's almost done. And that's it. You pretty much just wait for the basic installation to finish. At the end of this, it'll basically reboot, and then that's it. You have a working server. All you have to do now is configure it for your services, and with a minimal install, it'll literally have enough to boot and function as a Linux system. That's it. It's not going to have, you know, DNS server. It's not going to have a DHCP platform, you know, already installed. It's not going to have any of that. You're going to have to go through and, using the command line, install what you need. And there's a pretty deep repository of software available for Linux, for all flavors of Linux, not just CentOS. And for those who don't know, CentOS is what's called a fork or a clone of the commercial package called Red Hat. And basically what happened was the cost of Red Hat kept going up, and the community wanted something that had, you know, the stability and the flavor of Red Hat, but they wanted it completely free. So basically CentOS actually the C stands for community, ENT is enterprise, OS is operating system. So community enterprise operating system is what the name literally stands for. And some people call it CentOS. I just call it CentOS. It's easy. And we're coming up to the kernel creation, or configuring the core. And after this, it'll be pretty much ready to go. It'll quickly take off after this. The kernel is pretty much the brain of the OS, so, you know, it takes a little bit to put it down on disk. But once it's down, it'll move faster. So we're just going to give it its few seconds here that it needs. Usually what I do is, once I have the virtual machine created, I usually close that other window. It's not a big deal, but you can also make this full screen, you know, if you like a in-your-face type environment, you can make this full screen, or You can minimize it. What I love about virtualization is that you can literally put this wherever you want and it'll still continue to operate. In fact, I've used several VMware images, some of the other Linux ones that are on here, in parallel, so you can run 2 or 3 of them depending on what your hardware settings are set to, and you can literally use them as test servers. So even though you're not going to a physical machine somewhere in the cloud or whatnot, you can still use a virtual machine as an actual test system. So if, say you set up one of these as a database server and you want from your Mac to access that database server, without breaking anything, or say you're sitting at an airport and you don't have access to anything, you can still do that because internally it's the network. My Mac, in other words, can see this virtual machine without being on the Wi-Fi or being on a network. So it's actually a really neat way to test and try to break stuff or try to get into things. If you're doing security stuff, it's really cool for that. Okay, so it's now successfully installed and ready for you to use. Go ahead and reboot and start using it. So we reboot, this thing will go through its thing, and we're just going to let it do its thing. 5-second timeout there, and it'll boot. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to make this a little bit bigger. I probably should have done that earlier, but I didn't think of it. And see how fast that booted? There's literally nothing to it. So what I'm going to do is I'm now going to punch in my username and password that I created, and here we are. We're at the login screen. So that's pretty much it. One of the things that I might do is let's see if we can ping yes, we can. So what I can do is, since we can access Google servers, that means we have access to the internet, and DHCP worked out, and the network settings for the virtual machines are correct. So what we can do is we can run sudo yum update, and what we can do is we can actually pull recent updates for this OS, and it'll go through and pull them down. So we'll just give it a second, let it do its thing. This is on a Wi-Fi connection, so it is probably going to take a minute to establish, and boom, there it goes. So there are a bunch of updates. So you know what we're going to do? We're just going to hit yes on that, and we're going to let them run, because I think in order to have a really good functioning system, I think you have to start out with a solid base. So what are we doing here? We are adding, we're adding the signing key. So yes, key imported, good. And now it's going to go through, and this shouldn't take that long. There's 112 packages that needs installation, so I'll see if I can yap a little bit more about this. So as far as CentOS goes, I go back to version 4. I think that was the first version of CentOS Linux that I used, or it could have been CentOS 5. It was a long time ago. Let's just put it like that. CentOS doesn't release software very often. It's not like Mac, where every year you have a new version of Mac OS, or it's more like Microsoft, where they release Windows every few years. But what this essentially is this is a platform that you can build whatever you want on. And even if you go back to the installer, if you rewind this video and go back to the installer, that right-hand pane in the software selection window, there's a lot of options that are already pre-built that would probably work out for everyday stuff. Even there's a DHCP server in there that you can install. Like I said, I prefer to just do things my own way, and I like to know what I'm installing and what its dependencies are. So once the security stuff is done, and the initial patching is complete, everything else is literally, poked and prodded with as much detail as possible. You want to know what you're installing, especially if it's a server that's going to be sitting on the internet or being, accessed by the public. You want to be sure, you want to be absolutely sure that there's no way that that server is going to get breached. We always hear about somebody getting hacked, and although most of those hacks are engineered hacks, I believe most of them are social engineered hacks, but some of them are, hacks that are done by disgruntled employees or, people that just have too much time on their hands. So, whatever the case may be, you want to minimize risk from every angle that you possibly can. So that's it. So we're installed. We're going to just do a reboot. And when this comes up the next time, it'll be patched and it'll be good to go. You can just hit enter on that and it'll reboot. And I'll make this a little bit bigger. And we'll go through it. And you can see that, boom, it booted just like that. So it literally took seconds to boot. And at this moment, that's it. It's up to you to decide what to go and put on this server. What I'm going to do in the next video is I'm going to show how to install a DHCP server. Actually, even better, we're going to do a DNS server, because DNS servers are tricky, and a lot of people have asked me for DNS setups because Apple no longer supports DNS server inside their server.app program. They took it out. They took a lot of open source stuff out of their server app, and so that'll be a good one to demo. So I will do that in the next video. For now, I hope you enjoyed this. I hope it kind of showed how I do things, and just I know it's pretty generic, but there's 1,000 ways to do this. This is the one way that I found works out really well for me and my environments that I support. But every case is different. You have to literally look at what your use cases are. If you have a computer that, say, has only 8 gigs of RAM and 120 gig hard drive, if you have an older SSD from 5 years ago or whatever, where the drives were really small, then you obviously have to adjust for that. But if you have a lot of resources like this computer has, where it has a 2 terabyte drive and 32 gigs of RAM, whatnot, then play around with it. Feel free to rewind this video and go back and break it. That's the only way to learn, is trial and error. If you ask me, we've always done things where we'll go into an environment where, like, how do we support this? I don't know. Well, let's figure it out. Okay. And that's usually where the conversation starts, and we'll take it and we'll try to build stuff in a virtual machine, see how it works. If it's stable, great. If it's not stable, why is it not stable? Can we break it? Can we hack it? Can we tear it apart? How does it work? Do we know how to support it? And so on and so forth. So there's tons of different things you can do with this, and Linux is just scratching the surface. You can have Macs, you can have Windows, you can have firewall appliances, you can have phone system. I had a phone system running in VMware for a while. There's just an insane amount of options that you have here, and my only recommendation is to dive in and figure it out. Do what you want to do and see how it works out. And I'm sure in the end it'll all work out, and you're going to be much happier, that you learned something and that you got something out of it, and it'll just make life easier for you. Again, I hope you enjoyed this. come back and see the next video where I will demo how to install a DNS server right into this very virtual machine. So stick around, and I look forward to that. Have a good evening, and thank you for watching.